If you're 58 years old with $850,000 sitting in your 401k, you've probably heard this before. Once your portfolio is doing the heavy lifting, saving more doesn't move the needle. Stop contributing. Keep the difference. Enjoy the extra cash flow. There's a rule going around that puts a number on this. It's called the 25% crossover rule. Once your yearly investment growth is at least 4 times bigger than what you're putting in each year, the thinking goes, your own contribution barely matters anymore. The math behind that rule assumes a smooth 7% return, year after year. Real markets don't work that way. Stop saving on that assumption and retire straight into a bear market, and the numbers get ugly fast. Someone who follows that rule and hits a downturn in year 1 faces a 32% higher chance of running out of money before age 85 compared to someone who kept contributing for another 24 months. 2 more years of saving. That's the gap between a plan that survives a bad decade and one that doesn't. Today I want to show you a different way to find your real number, something I call the sequence of returns stress test. It accounts for the bad years, not just the good ones. And there's a second problem almost nobody talks about. The moment you stop contributing to your 401k, your taxable income jumps, and that can trigger a bill from the IRS that eats into the freedom you thought you'd already earned. If you're in that stretch between 55 and 65, watching your number and wondering whether it's really safe to ease off, stick around. I build these plans around the market we actually live in, not the smooth line in a calculator. Subscribe to Wes Investor for more of this. That 25% number comes from a simple mechanism. Say you've got $1 million invested, growing at a steady 7% a year. That's $70,000 of growth just from the market doing its job. Compare that to $10,000 a year in new contributions, and your own saving is only 14% of what your money is already earning on its own. The rule says once your contribution drops below 25% of your growth, it's barely worth the effort. This is simple compounding. The bigger your pile of money gets, the more it produces on its own, every year, without you doing anything extra. Your paycheck contribution stays roughly the same size, but the base it's being compared against keeps growing. Eventually, the math makes your own saving look small, even if it's the exact same amount you've always put in. I've watched a lot of people hit this exact moment. That's when it feels safe to coast. You've built something that's finally bigger than your paycheck, and there's a real pull toward that feeling, the sense that you've earned the right to relax, because you're officially a successful investor now. It's not a wrong thing to want. The problem is the math behind it assumes your portfolio grows in a straight line, every single year, forever. Markets don't move in a straight line. Picture that same $1 million portfolio in 2 different years. In a normal year, with a steady 7% return and no new contributions, it grows to $1,070,000. But in a year with a 15% market drop, the kind that happens more often than people expect, that same portfolio falls to $850,000 instead. Same starting point, same decision to stop saving, 2 very different outcomes. Look at the S&P 500's history, and a down year isn't rare. Stretches of negative returns show up roughly once every 4 years. The 25% rule quietly assumes that risk away, treating every year like the good years, and ignoring the 1 year in 4 when it isn't. That's the trade most people don't see when they stop contributing. It isn't just slower growth. It's losing the one thing that protects you when the market turns, fresh money still going in while prices are down, buying more shares for the same dollar. This is what people mean when they talk about sequence of returns risk. It's not just about the average return you get over 20 years. It's about the order those returns show up in. A bad year right at the start. The first year you stop adding money and start counting on the portfolio to carry itself does far more damage than the same bad year showing up a decade later, once your balance has had time to recover. But the market crash isn't even the part that catches people off guard the most. The bigger surprise shows up on your tax return the moment you stop contributing at all. Stopping your 401k contributions doesn't just stop your savings. It also raises your taxable income, right when you're trying to keep your tax bill under control heading into retirement. Take a couple earning $160,000 combined. While one of them maxes out a 401k with the full $32,500 catch-up contribution, their taxable income sits at $127,500. Stop that contribution, and the same $160,000 is now fully exposed. That's $32,500 of income that used to be sheltered, now taxed at your top bracket instead. In 2026, the total 401k deferral limit for anyone 50 and older is $32,500. Lose that deduction, and you're not just paying tax on more income. You can also get pushed into a higher effective rate once state taxes and the phase-out of certain credits get factored in. I used to tell people that once they reached what some call Coast FI, the point where a portfolio can grow into retirement mostly on its own, they should just enjoy the extra cash in their pocket. I was wrong about that. I hadn't accounted for how the newer senior deduction rules interact with a higher income once the contributions stop. So what's the smarter test? Instead of asking whether your growth is bigger than your contribution, ask a different question. Will 4% of your portfolio, added to your Social Security check, cover your expenses with a cushion left over for a bad stretch of markets? That's the real line. You stop saving when your portfolio at a 4% withdrawal rate, plus Social Security, covers your expenses plus a 20% buffer for volatility. Not before. Picture a $1 million portfolio. A 4% withdrawal comes to $40,000 a year. Add a $30,000 Social Security check, and you're at $70,000 of income. If your actual expenses run $55,000 a year, you've got room, but only about $15,000 of cushion. Build in a 20% volatility buffer on top of your expenses, roughly $11,000, and that gap shrinks to about $4,000. Comfortable, but nowhere near the wide margin the 25% rule made it feel like. That extra buffer isn't padding for padding's sake. It's what keeps you from having to sell shares at a loss during a down year just to pay your bills. Skip it, and the real cost shows up years later when a bad market forces you to lock in losses right when you can least afford to. That senior deduction also isn't unlimited. It starts phasing out once your income passes $75,000 for a single filer, or $150,000 for a married couple filing together. Push your taxable income higher by stopping your 401k contribution. And you're not just losing the contribution itself, you might be shrinking a deduction you were counting on too. Run the same math for someone single with $700,000 saved, and the cushion nearly disappears once you add the volatility buffer in. The 25% rule would tell that person they're already done. The resilience buffer says not yet. The old rule measures speed. The buffer measures resilience. One tells you how fast your money is growing. The other tells you whether that growth can survive a bad stretch without forcing you to sell at the worst possible time. It's a small shift in the question you ask, but it changes what being safe actually means, and it's a shift worth making before you touch a single contribution. So if the 25% rule oversells how safe you are, what's the actual number where it's safe to stop? It's not a single dollar figure. It's closer to how long it would take you to recover if the market turned against you the day you stopped. Go back to 1999. Someone hits their crossover number that year, decides they're done saving, and then the dot-com crash wipes 40% off their portfolio over the next 3 years. Without new money going in to buy shares while prices are down, it took roughly 7 years longer to recover than it did for someone who kept contributing straight through the crash. The 2007 to 2009 financial crisis tells a similar story. Portfolios lost close to half their value in about 18 months. Someone who kept contributing through that stretch was buying shares at some of the lowest prices in a decade, which meant their portfolio snapped back faster once the market turned. Someone who had already stopped missed that entire discount window. New contributions during a downturn work like buying on sale. Every dollar you put in during a 30% drop buys roughly 40% more shares than the same dollar did at the peak. Stop contributing right as prices fall, and you lose access to the exact moment your money would have worked hardest. None of this means the market always crashes right when you stop saving. It means the plan has to survive the years when it does, not just the years when it doesn't. And history says those years show up more often than most people budget for. That matters more than most people think, because retirement runs a lot longer than people plan for. A 65-year-old man in the U.S. today has roughly a 50% chance of living to 84, according to Social Security's own actuarial data. That's not a 10-year retirement you're funding. It's closer to a 20 or 30-year one. And that's just the men's numbers. Women in the same age group tend to live even longer on average, which stretches the funding window further still. A rule that looks good for 1 year can still leave you exposed for a decade. The 25% rule is built like a sprint. Retirement runs like a marathon, and a plan that only works when the market cooperates isn't really a plan. It's a hope. Meet David and Sarah. They're 60, with $1,200,000 saved between them. Their portfolio is growing by about $84,000 a year at a steady 7% return, and their $20,000 annual contribution looks small next to that, so they decide to stop. Now picture the kind of stretch the market has handed retirees before, a flat decade. Not a crash, just years of going nowhere, the kind we saw between 1966 and 1982, and again from 2000 to 2010. Flat decades like that usually start the same way, with valuations already stretched high before the flat stretch even begins. The market doesn't need a crash to go nowhere for 10 years. It just needs to spend a decade catching up to where prices already got ahead of themselves. For David and Sarah, that gap isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It's the difference between retiring with a real cushion and retiring right at the edge, hoping nothing goes wrong for the next 20 years. If David and Sarah stop contributing and the market goes flat for 5 years, inflation still doesn't take a break. At around 3% a year, their purchasing power erodes even while the number on their statement looks unchanged. By the time they're 65, that $1,200,000 is still $1,200,000 on paper, but it only buys about $1,035,000 worth of what it used to. They're behind before they've even stopped working. Now run the other version. David and Sarah keep contributing $32,500 each, every year, right through that same flat stretch. Even with zero market growth, 5 years of contributions alone add $325,000 to their portfolio. By 65, they're sitting at $1,525,000, built almost entirely from paychecks and the tax savings that came with them, not from the market doing them any favors. That $325,000 isn't market magic. It's just two people showing up every year and writing the check, even when the market gives them nothing in return. It's the one part of the plan that doesn't depend on what stocks do. Social Security's cost of living adjustment for 2026 sits at 2.8%. That's a reminder that your future expenses keep climbing, whether the market moves or not. Your portfolio has to outgrow both your spending and inflation at the same time, not just one or the other. It's a small percentage on paper, but stretched over 2 or 3 decades of retirement. Small percentages compound into real money, the same way your original contributions did. It's not a dramatic difference on the surface. It's the difference between a plan that bends and one that breaks. Still, some of this isn't really about the math. What if you're just tired, and the number was never really the point? Step 1. Run your own stress test. Take whatever crossover number you've calculated and check it again using a 5% return instead of 7%. If the math still holds up at that more conservative number, you're in genuinely good shape. If it doesn't, that's your answer, and it's better to find out now than 3 years into retirement. That 5% figure isn't random. It's roughly a 20% haircut off the standard 7% assumption, which is exactly the kind of buffer that turns a number that only works in good years into one that holds up in bad ones too. If your crossover number still works after that haircut, you're not just hoping for the best. You've actually tested for the worst. Step 2. Before you cut your contribution to zero, consider dropping it to just your employer match instead. You keep the free money coming in, you still get shares bought every year at whatever the market happens to be doing, and you free up real cash flow for the things you actually want to spend on. Even half your normal contribution, if that's all your budget allows, keeps that mechanism alive. The goal isn't to save at full speed forever. It's to never fully switch it off while the market can still turn on you. Step 3. Run the numbers with and without your contribution, using the current senior deduction rules if you or your spouse is 65 or older. See what stopping actually costs you in taxes before you decide it's worth it. Run it both ways, on paper, before you make the call. Most people are surprised by how much of the money they thought they'd free up actually goes straight to the IRS instead of their pocket. I sat with a couple last year who wanted to stop saving so they could buy a $60,000 RV outright. When we ran the numbers, staying the course for just 14 more months meant the tax savings alone covered about half of it. They still bought the RV. They just waited a little over a year to do it, and it cost them less to get there. That's a real trip, still taken, just funded a little more efficiently. Even once the math checks out, there's a hurdle that stops most people from ever feeling like it's actually safe to ease off, no matter how big the number gets. Psychologists have a name for what happens next. It's not really loss aversion, though that's part of it. It's closer to something called the arrival fallacy, the idea that reaching a goal is supposed to feel like a finish line. In practice, the moment you get there, your mind quietly moves the goalposts, because now there's something real to lose. This shows up again and again in retirement research. People who hit their savings goal often keep working or keep saving, well past the point where the math says they could stop. It's not because the math is wrong. It's because stopping feels like giving up your only real control over an uncertain outcome. And that feeling doesn't disappear just because a spreadsheet says you're ready. If stopping your 401k contributions after 30 years of doing it without fail feels unsettling, that's a completely normal reaction. It's a little like taking your foot off the gas and taking off your seatbelt while the car is still moving. You built a habit that kept you safe for decades, and turning it off, even when the math says it's fine, doesn't feel fine right away. That fear doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means the decision matters, and your mind knows it. The goal isn't to force the fear away. It's to build a plan solid enough that the fear doesn't have to make the decision for you. One thing that helps: don't frame it as stopping. Frame it as redirecting. Instead of sending that money into the market, put it into a high-yield cash bucket that covers 2 years of expenses. That gives you a real shield against a bad sequence of returns, and it tends to make the decision feel a lot less like free-falling and a lot more like a plan. The 25% rule isn't a bad starting point. It's just not a full retirement plan on its own. It doesn't account for a market that drops in year 1, for the tax changes that came with the newer senior deduction, or for the fact that the old WEP and GPO penalties on Social Security have been repealed and no longer apply the way older advice assumes. You've already done the hard part. You built a nest egg most people never manage to build. This last stretch isn't about second-guessing yourself. It's about making sure a simplified rule of thumb from a video doesn't quietly undo what 30 years of saving accomplished. Nobody builds a plan like this by accident. It takes 30 years of paychecks, decisions, and a fair number of years where the market gave you nothing back. Respect that work enough to test it properly before you decide it's finished. That's the whole point of a stress test. Not to scare you into saving forever, but to make sure the finish line you're aiming for is actually where you think it is. If you want to see how this kind of stress test plays out against a real crash like 2008, subscribe to Wes Investor and take a look at more of our videos on sequence of returns risk. Retirement was never about hitting a number. It's about keeping it.